Okay, I'm going to get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Sebastian Faber. I am a member of the ALBA Board of Governors, and I teach at Oberlin College in Ohio. And I'm really pleased to see you all here. And I say see you all here, but I don't actually see you this time around because we switched formats. We are trying out the webinar format in Zoom, which has the disadvantage that you cannot see everybody's faces. It has the great advantage for us that there's a slightly better security layer so that the kind of disruptions that we suffered the last couple of times hopefully will not occur. And if you are thinking to yourself, disruptions, I didn't see any disruptions last couple of times. That is purely thanks to the defensive work of Dennis and Mark, especially Dennis, who kept a watchful eye out. But that still caused a lot of stress and tension on all of us. So we're hoping this webinar format will provide a better alternative. We will still be able to do breakout rooms and things like that. And you can still ask questions. Just use the question button should be in your interface. Still, I'm super pleased to see to know that so many of you are here. And I'm also thrilled to welcome two admired colleagues, Jordana Mendelsohn and Amaya Tripathi, both from NYU. I'll say just a couple of words about them. I won't cover their entire CV, which is too extensive anyway, but you can look them up. Just super briefly, Jordana is an art historian. She's been at NYU for many years. She was at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign before that. She has a PhD from Yale. And Jordana is really one of the foremost experts worldwide on the visual culture of the 1930s, especially as it pertains to Spain. In addition to writing and editing books, including the seminal book called Documenting Spain, Artists, Exhibition Culture, and the Modern Nation, which came out with Penn State UP in 2005, which really has influenced many of us in the field. In addition to that, she's also curated a series of exhibits throughout the years. One of the distinctive features, I think, of her work is that she is equally conversant conversant with and admired by scholars in the Anglophone world and scholars in the Spanish-speaking world. She's also currently co-editor of the best journal in our field, which is the Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies. So it's really amazing to have Jordana here with us. And she's participated in a couple of, or led a couple of workshops on visual culture of the 1930s. And we're super pleased to have her as part of this film series. Amaya Tripathi at NYU for a slightly less long time than Jordana. A more recent addition to that amazing department, which we have so many friends. Like Jordana, Amaya studies the Spanish Civil War as an international event that produced a series of incredibly interesting media in different languages and cultures. I think both Jordana and Maya look at the Spanish Civil War as an event that we are still trying to understand through images and narratives. Media, like images and narratives that in and of themselves sort of bring up all kinds of questions about truth and documentation and what is documentary and what is propaganda that are still incredibly relevant today. Amaya's main project currently has to do with revolutionary documents understood broadly, coming out of the Spanish Civil War in multiple languages and produced by multiple actors, including representatives from the non-aligned movement in the world. For those of you interested in his work, I would point you to a very accessible piece that he wrote in The Volunteer about a year ago. I think it came out in the September 2024 issue about Neru's visit to Spain, which is fascinating. So I'll leave the introduction there. I'll just have Jordana and Amaya take over here. Thank you guys for doing this, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Sebastian.
Thank you, Sebastian.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Mark. We're really thrilled to be here. I'm sad that we can't see everyone because unlike in class, when you say something sour and you get a reaction, we're not going to kind of know anyone's reaction. So please use the Q&A button liberally, even if it's just a, go team to keep us going. So Ame and I thought that we would start with some kind of definitions and laying the groundwork for really how the 1930s was the decade of newsreels and documentary called all different things, noticiarios, reportajes. So we're going to talk a little bit about that generally. Then we're going to do a little bit of a kind of teach-in so that we can start thinking about how these generic group of documentaries really worked differently. And to try and start sketching out some differences between the two documentaries that we had you walk through, two newsreels. We're going to show a couple of clips, and then I guess after we've done a little bit of a teach-in, then you'll go in your breakout rooms, and hopefully then we'll also come back and chat together. So I'm going to share the screen, and we're gonna get going. So just give us a minute to get things going so that you can see them well. I think hopefully everyone can see this. So thought we would start with the most obvious, since we as you know from the session, it's the newsreels and the Spanish Civil War. And when I teach this with my students, it's kind of a subtle difference, but it's a little bit important in that newsreels became a kind of commercial artifact. They were generally made by either commercial enterprises or state enterprises as compilations of material. They oftentimes have a strong kind of point of view. And often that point of view that's commercial may be kind of couched as neutral, even though it may not be. You may recognize some of the names of newsreel producers like British or French Pathé. Pathé newsreels are widely visible now on YouTube. We've got a couple to share with you. They're meant to be part of a film program. They were oftentimes scheduled together before a feature film. The earliest newsreels used a large format camera, so they were largely static images in movement. And as we move into the 1930s, you're going to see that the camera work really changes so that they do a lot more footage on the scene that is brought into newsreels. Um, Contrasting that with documentary, and again, a little bit remedial for those of you who have already been thinking about this material for a long time, but that the documentary has a much stronger narrator's and editor's voice, even while it still seeks to wear the robes of neutrality and objectivity. You may have heard some of the key documentary filmmakers like Robert Flaherty, Nanook of the North, John Grierson, or if you're working in the United States context, you would be very familiar with the kind of documentary work that characterized the 1930s here from the Farm Security Administration, in which those materials are really given a narrative that is both authorial for folks like Dorothea Lange or others, or given as part of the script that was used to take photographs and movies. So here, what you see in documentary is there's oftentimes a more skilled attention to how the scenes are framed, the kind of narration that is brought into it, and there's a little bit more dramatization. But in secondary and primary literature, and also literature during the 1930s, you will oftentimes see documental, right? Documentary used to describe all kinds of these cinematic forms, whether it's noticiario, newsreel, reportaje, or a documentary. So it's quite unstable, even though you'll see that if we think about intention or production, they seem to have correspond to different kind of buckets of production. Does that sound kind of right? Um, so we thought we would rewind a little bit to before the Spanish Civil War and connect also some earlier material with what we had you watch for today, largely España 1936, which had Luis Buñuel's involvement. And in the literature, there's a lot of discussion about that reportaje's relationship to what is oftentimes described as like the surrealist documentary par excellence, which was Luis Buñuel's Las Azules Tierras Sin Pan, Land Without Bread. But what I'd like to contrast it to with you is and we're talking about like a minute, 2 minutes, nothing excerpt. First, from what is really more like a newsreel, which was produced by the pedagogical missions, documenting their work in rural Spain in 1932. you'll see there a really kind of smooth work of the camera in which editing is not used as a disruptive tool. What you'll see in Las Urdes Tierras Sin Pan is the introduction of editing as a disruptive tool. And then we're going to bring it back into España 1936, which was not only composed of a lot of Soviet newsreel footage, but also very much coming out of a conversation around editing and montage that Buñuel is aware of and that dialogues with Soviet cinema. So there's a lot to unpack here, but we thought we would just share these clips. So let me go here. Let me stop sharing and bring this up. This is when we've happily been out of practice since the pandemic. So again, we're going to first share this. Again, this is just a minute from this pedagogical missions. For those of you that don't speak Spanish, what the intertitle says is basically at night, the town gathers together to watch educational films, talks, oration, lectures, and during the day, the mission is in a very happy open air school. And this is without sound on purpose. It's a silent newsreel. So what you'll notice in newsreels like this, that was made by the pedagogical missions, is that it's really demonstrative. They're a genre of filmmaking that tries to show and share, usually in a kind of didactic way. So again, editing is used here to compose a story, but is not really meant to unlock for you a kind of tool for reflection, which we'll see is very different from Las Vegas. So here you see the scenes of the outdoor school. It's a kind of mid-distance. Most of the filmmakers and photographers with the pedagogical missions were also amateur filmmakers. And now I'm going to share with you, oops, sorry. Now I'm going to share with you from Las Urdes. I think we have the audio share.
Yeah.
And this is again a 1933 film by Luis Buñuel. It actually was co-written by Pierre Unique, who also writes the commentary for España 1936 that you watched. And we can talk a little bit more about that. And this film, if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. The view that we're watching is the copy that Buñuel deposited with the Museum of Modern Art.
Bread was unknown to the Hudanos.
Can you all hear that audio okay?
The bread these children are eating was given to them at school. The master usually makes them eat it in front of him, for fear that it be taken away from them by their half-starved parents. And now to school. These barefooted urchins receive exactly the same primary education as children all over the world. The clothing, or what there is of it, is brought into this region by those of the Hudanos who go to Castile and Andalusia for several months every year. Upon their return, they exchange their clothes for potatoes. These children are famished, but they are taught that the sum of the angles of a triangle equal 2 right angles. Very frequently in the Hudano villages, most of the children are pilus, that is, abandoned children. The Hudano women walk for days across the mountains in order to get a pilu from the orphanage of Ciudad Rodrigo. They are paid 15 pesetas a month for taking charge of them. This sum used to feed a whole family, until very recently when the pilu trade was forbidden by the government. And what is this fair lady doing here?
Okay, so what I'm hoping you saw there was a very different use of, in both cases, considered documentary films. But in the Misiones, you see that it's informative, it's didactic, and the way that the camera moves and the editing moves doesn't jostle you out of your kind of cognitive zone. But in Buñuel, there's a very intentional use of juxtaposition, of editing, a contrast and tension between narrative and image, such that you begin to look at that footage with a bit of a more ironic glance. So that kind of disruptive montage, Buñuel also wrote about it, and he wrote quite a lot in the 1920s and 30s, and he talked about segmentation, fragmentation, and is really learning a lot of lessons about editing, again, not only through avant-garde cinema, of course, but also through Soviet cinema. So again, we're going to be thinking about not only how these films describe themselves, but also the different lineages that they correspond to. So what you'll notice is that both of the films that we've screened for you use reportaje in the title. They don't use noticiario, they don't use documental. So we thought it would be important also to raise that as a term. And you can see here that for synonyms, we talk about documentary, crónica, but reportaje also links back to the illustrated press, to photojournalism, which was also kind of one of the most important practices associated with the Spanish Civil War. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So if you think about these different strains of picture making that are happening in the 1920s and 30s before the Civil War, you have on the one hand the growth of the illustrated press, the growth of kind of photographers submitting their work for publication in the press. At the same time that you have an emergence kind of avant-garde and surrealist cinema. And oftentimes the players that are touching on both of those areas are in conversation with each other. So to remind you, because again, my hat is to talk about España 1936 a little bit, before Buñuel is engaged with that film, and he's credited with being the selector of footage as well as the kind of arranger of sound, he did 1929 Un Chien Andalou with Salvador Dali, which was considered kind of the surrealist film par excellence. He also filmed L'Âge d'Or, which is really a biting critique of the elite, that has opening sequences that look a bit like the scientific films of a filmmaker named Jean-Paul Levé, so playing with these genres of documentary. And at the same time that he films L'Âge d'Or, he also films a 2-minute documentary of Dali's father, which we can't get into right now, but to say that he plays with these different documentary forms. And then, as I just shared with you, he also films Land Without Bread. Pierre Unique is on the team with him. The cameraman is Elie Lothar, who is part of a kind of dissident, surrealist, avant-garde circle. And Pierre Unique, again, will come back and write the commentary for España 1936. And while España 1936 is in the cinema in Paris, the sonorized version of Land Without Bread in French is also screened in Paris with a kind of epilogue that frames it in the context of the Spanish Civil War. So one could have, in the same breath, seen this very striking, ethnographic film from 1933 with, again, a kind of coda that frames it in relation to the Civil War that is very disruptive aesthetically, alongside España 36, and we'll show a few clips from España 36, and they really start to kind of contaminate each other in terms of how Buñuel is playing with documentary. So again, to remind you of the opening, and España 1936 opens with, it talks about being a great reportage, and also puts forward the idea that these are documents, and that what this film strives to do is to bring together documents from all sides of the conflict together. Because as it says in 1937, what we need to do is simply reproduce fact. Now, I didn't share with you the opening of Las Urdes Tierra Sin Pan, but that also begins with a kind of intertotal that says that this is a document of human geography. So when we have filmmakers like Buñuel saying this is merely a document, this is a reproduction of fact, we have to go back to the fact that the avant-garde in the 1930s thought that facts were the most revolutionary of aesthetic forms because of how they could be presented with microscopes through juxtaposition, that facts, here celebrated for their objectivity, were also considered kind of revolutionary tools, right? And Amaya is going to get more into that, I'm sure. So I just wanted to bring us back to that idea of reportaje and photojournalism, that Pierre Unique, while he was writing the commentary for España 1936, is also the editor of a communist illustrated magazine in Paris called Regard. Regard does a great, and Sebastian actually should come back in and talk about Regard and the circulation of photographs, which maybe he can do later since he's written entire essays on the circulation of these images. But you might recognize the kinds of images that we see in 1936, for example, of the bombardments, of the dead children. This is material that was circulating widely in Regards at the same time as España 1936 is being pieced together by Buñuel. So I'm going to shift over to Ameya, and then we'll open it up for questions and kind of reflection on some of this material.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jordana.
Okay, hop out of this.
Yeah. Well, you already had the introductory video, or it's still available also if you want to go back to me talking a little bit more about the context behind Reportaje del Movimiento Revolucionario. I guess one of probably the most, it's to my knowledge, one of, if not the very first films or video material about the Spanish Civil War. And it's already striking that the title does not refer directly to a war, but to a revolutionary movement. So that itself is curious. And then what it got me thinking about was what was at stake in documenting a social revolution. You can think about other films about revolution, Battleship Potemkin. You can think about early footage from the Mexican Revolution or elsewhere that might be different from thinking about a war film. And Santos's other surviving film, which is called Barcelona Trabaja para el Frente, so Barcelona works for the front, and it's much more clearly a war film, which has a lot of industrial production. You can see people working towards getting the kind of goods that are going to be needed on the war front, though there is a little bit of that as well. So I thought, I don't know if maybe we'll get into the breakout rooms earlier or not, we'll see. But I thought I'd just run over a little bit some of the other materials that I came across when looking at his magazine, Popular Film, which he was the editor of in Barcelona. He was largely a writer about film, and you would say sort of a somewhat amateur filmmaker. And so in the early 30s, he's bristling against the influence of foreign film studios, especially with the advent of sonorization, of adding sound to film, at the fact that although Spain has a large culture of movie going, it's largely dominated by cinema from outside, from Hollywood and elsewhere. And he's trying to, and continuously arguing in the editorials of Popular Film for Spanish produced film. Ideally, he would, and him and other contemporaries such as Jose Peratz and Piqueras are actually arguing ideally for a cine social, like a film produced ideally with a working class or social or popular base, but as a starting point, to have an idea of a nationally produced Spanish cinema. So you get those editorials in the early 30s, and we maybe will talk about some of the differences within all of the left movements as well. But if we go back to this idea of him being a writer, in this early period, he's comparing what the utility is of the camera that can capture the visual fact to the written press. And this is in a period in which, you might try to say this about the contemporary moment, but there's a real sense of pessimism. Don't believe what you read in the written press, to do with the spread of written propaganda, poster propaganda during also some of the elections and the period of the Spanish Second Republic, especially at the beginning of the Bienio Negro. There's a kind of huge avalanche of written press, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with or have read about. So Santos is coming into this period thinking about what it is that film does that writing doesn't do. And there are some of the same claims that Jordana was mentioning, thinking about scientific film. So you've got the newsreel, read the English, resides precisely in the exactitude with which it reproduces events. So it's exact. In it, reality is present, alive, and kicking. But there's still a kind of written basis to some of the way, and I would say this is perhaps unlike other filmmakers. There's kind of set of written metaphors that are still there. The celluloid is described as pages, right? So this idea of the reportaje gráfico, the illustrated magazine, is there's a very literal kind of metaphor towards the end of the quote, that these pages of celluloid are more veridical and competent than the spreads of the newspapers. And then there are the other advantages in terms of audience, illiterate audiences. And Santos himself was actually quite a fan of silent film because it was seen as an international language, right? Once sound film starts coming in, the questions start arising as to which language you're going to. Are you going to use Catalan or Castellano or whatever other language you're going to use? So he's also fighting a bit of a rear guard about that. So that's some of his context as a writer in this period. We can talk more about some of this goal of trying to foment not only film the working class, but to foment a basis for working class people, trade unionists to film their own cinema. And with that, as I may have covered in the introductory video, there was the full-on collectivization of these cinema spaces. So it's not just that an occupation of a city is being depicted, but actually enacted by many of the trade unionists themselves. And this is a remarkable moment in cinema history. I mean, we cannot say with any certainty what the class status of every person who was a camera operator on the film was, but critics have said that this is the first time that participants in a revolution are filming it live. I mean, there are different ways you can measure that claim. So that's also part of that context. And then I think and I wanted to show you actually photographs
later too.
Yeah. Like this photograph here of the program, you can see at the top it says Sindicato Unido de Espectáculos Públicos, and this is from January 1937, and they've actually taken over the whole set of film releases. So that was to give you some of the early context, and there's more we can talk about. I'll just show one clip to show, because one of the things that critics have talked about, and perhaps we'll talk about, is maybe, unlike the Buñuel, a bit of a divorce between the written commentary that's read, the voiceover, and the image. And this seemed to be something that people took a lot of advantage of. So I'm just going to play one clip of a British newsreel. So I'll stop, I'll set that up in a minute.
And then do here. And then you have it up already.
Okay.
It's one of these ones.
This
That one?
Yeah. And then I go back to share.
Oh, yeah. Go.
Okay. And here.
I think you already have the.
Yeah. So this is from British Pathé. And well.
Pathé Gazette brings you some remarkable pictures of the Spanish Civil War in Barcelona. Many in the city are in a state of terror. Barricades have been erected in almost every street, and behind them the popular party keeps up a desultory firing. Buildings that were world famous for their beauty have been despoiled, and in the frenzy of the struggle, all the churches desecrated. Masterpieces of art and culture have been sacrificed to the god of war. Nothing that might have hindered the cause of the defender has been allowed to remain unharmed. Even looting has taken place under the protection of loaded rifles. Then the burning of the looted treasures completes the orgy of destruction.
Learn Spanish with Real Spanish TV.
No veo nada, no veo nada.
Click on work.
Okay, we're back. So you can, for yourselves, think about how different that British commentary was to what you watched in Reportaje. And maybe we'll leave it there, but you have also that idea of the divorce between writing and image.
And I'll pop up just a clip from
Yes.
that. So just popping back in here. So one of the things that we thought would be good, because we know you've watched them already, but we had I wanted to, since I'd given you some background on how Buñuel was engaging with montage, and just to say, at the time that Buñuel is working on España in 1936, he's working in Paris for the Spanish embassy, for the Spanish government. He is charged with basically producing and distributing propaganda films in Paris related to the Spanish Civil War. He's also engaged with the 1937 Spanish Pavilion, which, for those of you who follow Guernica and Calder's Mercury Fountain, that was the same pavilion that had Guernica, and Buñuel was in charge of helping to put together the film programming on that. I just wanted to very quickly share you. I think Dennis is telling us we're going to go into rooms, but not yet. Let me just share with you one thing here. We're just going to look at a few seconds of this, but you'll notice the very different approach that in the other documentaries and newsreels, you'll have more of a flow of footage. And what you see in España 1936 is not only a very quick editing across scenes, but you'll also see a great disjuncture between sound and image. And I'm going to bring this up to you and then show you another very quick clip. Okay, so just since that's familiar with you, let me just pull up one other brief clip before we get here. Let me just get that. See, we're all moving around our desktop. Hold on a sec. Okay, I just want to share this with you as well. So here you see, in between the footage, this array of posters, which cinematically is very disruptive. And it goes back to footage. One of the things that I wanted to point out here is that when Buñuel organizes the selection of this material, it's not all moving footage. He also incorporates into his montage Robert Capa photographs, these scenes of posters, as you've seen. And as, again, someone who's involved in the 37 Pavilion and would have seen the posters by people like Giuseppe Ranau, these large photo panels, it's like he's bringing into España 1936 not only the limits or the lessons that he's learned from surrealist editing and Soviet editing, but also this broad array of visual culture of war, and he kind of packs it in. And if you've watched it, you've also seen that he does overlays. It's actually quite experimental with the editing. And then the commentary, again, was by Pierre Unique, who creates a very intentioned, communist-informed commentary. So I think we covered some basics, but it'd be great to kind of go through I think there are a bunch of questions in the chat and.
Yeah. So what I was gonna suggest is, I know we have some outstanding questions in the chat. And we can do the breakout rooms, the brief discussion. We're going to give people 15 minutes to talk about what we've discussed thus far, and then we'll come back and try and answer these in turn because you two can see them. Is that acceptable to panelists?
Yeah, that sounds great. And you'll read the questions out loud for us, Dennis?
Yes, absolutely.
All right.
Okay.
Are we popping into any of the breakout rooms?
I'm going to put you in one if that's all right, and then if you. Yeah, I'm gonna put you in
We'll see which lucky group gets
yes,
the two of us.
There you go. It's a fun little game of roulette there. Okay, so to addressing the whole group here, you will be prompted to enter a breakout room with He prompted him to the breakout room. We'll probably talk for 15 to 20 minutes. I'll be popping in and out to see if there's a group leader you want to recommend to report your findings and to make sure everything's going all right. So you should. I'm going to open.
Um, so Dennis, we talked before the breakout that you can see the questions. I don't know if or Sebastian, if you want to choose some questions, or if there are more questions also in the chat now from after the breakout films.
I think we do. How many groups did we have, Dennis? I think we want to hear from our
6.
group leaders too, right?
6. We had 6 groups. I think we can go through them pretty quick, and then we can again go through some of these questions that are in the question and answer chat. Should be good. Okay. So I mean, for group 1, I think we have. Let me see. This is the first time I'm doing this here. Randall from group 1, you should be able to speak if you would like, and you can report to us on what your group spoke on.
Yeah, we just, I guess, kind of talked about what jumped out at us. And I don't think I can kind of find a common thread off the top of my head, but I'll just read through what I jotted down. Josie mentioned that it was easier to see what was going on in the Pathé footage from the UK. And yeah, I don't know if, obviously language has something to do with it, but it did seem less abstract to me too than some of the other stuff that we saw. Adria was wondering if she was seeing real footage or if this was some sort of kind of they were doing some sort of cinematography there to express something, or if it was just strictly documentary footage. She mentioned that in España 1936, people were walking around doing normal things, like smoking cigarettes. They were maybe putting up a barrack or, walking through the streets. They were living their lives. And she kind of pointed out that there was a contrast to that then in Pathé, where they were focused on specific actions, but then those actions, they may not have been normal, but if I understood this right, they made them kind of seem normal. It wasn't sort of day-to-day stuff. Then Luke pointed out that there was a lot of dramatization in this, and maybe it was hard for some of us to to spot the difference between what is documentary footage there, what is being dramatized, and then how they're dramatizing it, which methods they're using to do that.
Yeah.
Sebastian, yeah, jump in. If I'm getting this wrong, somebody jump in.
No, these are amazing observations.
Okay,
We're just
I got 2
listening.
more. I got 2 more. I'll go real quick. Sebastian mentioned that people might not have trusted the media as much in one respect, but also they may have been a little bit more used to people in that time period when they were watching this when it came out. They might have been more used to seeing images inserted there just because it was harder to get some of the footage at that time. So you had to do that sort of thing to create these newsreels. And then Magdalena wondered, which is very interesting to me, could students tell if this footage was real or was it staged? Right. And she also mentioned how shocking it was to see the images of dead kids in there. Yeah. And I wonder if my students would need to have this framed before showing it to them so they knew what they were looking at. Or maybe it'd be good to ask them afterwards. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, one is to remind ourselves that these, whether they're called noticiarios or reportajes or newsreels or documentaries, that these were the method through which people encountered images of war. So, but then to your point is the range of ways that the war could be framed was really varied. And even in those two reportajes that we had you all watch, you know, I suspect that, Jeff Pingree was in our group, and we all were saying like we'd love to just talk to we'd love to just talk to Buñuel and ask him. But given Buñuel's precedent as doing Un Chien Andalou in 29, where he cuts the cow eye, Las Urdes, where he shoots a goat off the mountain, all of the kinds of ways that Buñuel would engage with image making as a kind of revolutionary potential, right? I mean, he's coming out of surrealism where he wants to shock to change your conscience, whether that shock is through editing or through the footage himself. So in España 1936, you see that kind of very disturbing footage, right, of the dead children, the use of close-ups. It's an unflinching eye. And I don't know this, but one is that Buñuel was charged with making the propaganda to distribute throughout Paris. And all of that did not look the same, right? But that in this particular compilation, again, partnering with Pierre Unique, who he had already partnered with for Las Urdes Tierra Sin Pan, when we see images like that, we have to understand them as being intentionally included, right? It's not just that the camera is set on autopilot and happens to capture some horrific scene. It's that they are intentionally compiling a range of footage. Some of it's done by Soviet filmmakers who are there that Roman Gubern and Paul Hammond have tracked through. They did an amazing kind of just precise research on this film and were able to identify still photographs by Robert Capa, by many other foreign photojournalists. So in España 1936, if you see that footage there, it's meant to be there. So if we register it as shocking, we might then think, what was the value of that shock that Buñuel thought he was adding to this newsreel, to this reportage, to its audience members? Are we supposed to be enraged into action? Are we supposed to be angry at the German and the Italians for, providing the armaments that are causing this destruction? So, what is the kind of function of that emotional energy that the film is stirring up versus a more informative newsreel that's kind of more like current events, like there was we are on the front of Guadarrama and this is happening. And that footage tends to share wartime scenes in a more kind of, third person way. What's fascinating is that in Gubern and Hammond's book, which is called Louis Buñuel, The Red Years, they talk about that Buñuel kind of did everything to keep himself off the front lines, that Buñuel stayed in Paris, made many arguments for staying in Paris, did not want to be in Spain, and did not want to be on the front lines shooting footage, but said, I can do more work in the studio. I can take all of this footage and I can put it back together again in different forms. So that's also kind of interesting to think about who's on the front line doing the footage, what kind of filmmakers or recorders are they in relation to those who are in studios editing the footage for effect. And often I wonder, if I were in a film cinema in Paris, what would my reaction be to seeing the same kind of footage potentially in different newsreels, right? As Amaya shared, some of this footage is visible from earlier newsreels that then appear in later ones. And if you had a visual memory, you might recall some of that in your memory bank, right? Sorry, it's so weird not having you all here to be like, yeah, right. I'm just gonna lean on Sebastian to like shake his head.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you, Randall. Gonna go group 2 was Laura Hartman. Laura, if you'd like to just briefly summarize what your group talked about, be greatly appreciated. And yeah, very much appreciated. You should be able to speak now if you'd like.
Yeah, great. Actually, hi. A lot of the points were covered by Randall and just addressed, having to do with, having to do with like thinking about using these reels in the classroom. And a number of the members of the group, myself included, did not do the homework. And so we were working off of the clips shown just now during the introduction before putting us into breakout rooms. And I don't know, like one of our main takeaways was thinking about one of the issues that Randall brought up about the trustworthiness of the images and how just today we have such a suspicion about, videos and visual images. And one of the things that we were discussing is that there might have been the sense of a suspicion about the editing, a suspicion about how these things are being put together, but what is being portrayed cannot be faked, right? Like you cannot fake the destruction, you cannot fake the war. Like this actually matters. Um, Matters in the sense of it has to be true, but that the interplay between what is being portrayed and the voiceover really makes a difference with how it's being interpreted in a way that with the documentary photograph, you are allowed more way in as a viewer to make your own interpretation. So some of the insights from our group.
Yeah.
Thank you, Laura.
Yeah, that's really great kind of framing of the question. I think first, I think, I think to remember that in the 1930s, people aren't naive viewers. I was just teaching the Spanish American War in my class, and we talk about, the rise of yellow journalism and the fact that, in early silent film, there was manipulation of imagery, there was early science fiction films. But I think to your point is there's an awareness that this film is edited, and then there's the overwhelming proof of the images, right? So even when, as you pointed out, a viewer might be aware of the montage, those children did die, right? Now in the case of Buñuel, since he's also been a prankster in other films, you might be like, well, is the baby really dead? Because in Las Lourdes, I'm not sure if that baby is really dead or not. So there are filmmakers, because of their particular approach, that introduce doubt as part of their filmmaking, experience. But I think at the beginning of España 1936, the reason why I show the intertitles is it says like facts are important. And what this newsreel is going to do, what this reportage is going to do, is going to bring together footage from both sides of the war and from the different kind of positions, because we're interested in you having the fullest view of the war as possible. Of course, we know that Buñuel's team is editing it in a particular way. But I think to your point, there's no watching that footage and thinking that the war is not happening. And then the particular crafting of those images is meant to perhaps push us towards one alliance or another, which I think the narrative also kind of helps to kind of push the viewer into one narrative or another. Are you going to engage sympathetically with this? Are you going to engage in a kind of outraged way? Are you going to be left apathetic because you're not sure exactly what to do? But I don't think that any of the films are trying to doubt the veracity of what the scenes are that are being represented, even if in their exact details or in the kind of way that it's put together, it may or may not have taken place on that day or at that moment, but was certainly part of the war. Do you want to add?
I just echoing like a bit about from Randall and Laura's about not knowing what some of the issues would be involved in teaching these images of dead children, that this is an echo of exactly some of the debates that were happening in the period with
That's right.
all of the editors. So we were
Yeah.
just talking the other day.
That's right.
Was it in Mirabal?
Yeah, there's a children's magazine put out by the Catalan government called Mirbal. And in Mirbal, they reproduced the photographs that Jaume Miret, who was the director of the Commissariat de Propaganda, had commissioned of the bombardments in Madrid of the dead children. And in the anarchist press, they launched a vitriol against this, saying, how can you, in a children's magazine, try to direct children's political thoughts so heavy-handedly, right? And that this is kind of an abhorrence, that instead a children's magazine should foster, joy and discovery and all of a kind of anarchist lifestyle of self-discovery, and should not be directing them ideologically at that young age. And so to Amaya's point, we're not just coming up with those debates, but the debates were there and present in the press throughout the period and in official documents as well. And there was censorship as well. So it's not that Buñuel, for example, just had a free hand over putting together whatever footage that he wanted. He was in the Spanish embassy and being very clear directives in terms of the kind of propaganda imagery that was meant to be put out, So yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Laura. I think group three had Jordana and Amaya in it, so I would push to you and see if you've anybody you'd like to call on or anything you'd like to discuss in particular. from your session.
Well, we had nominated Kate, but I don't know if she wants to come on or not. Like,
I
she was
will.
from teaching, but we could ask her.
Kate, you can speak. We'd love to hear your thoughts if
Sure,
you.
I can try.
Uh,
Thank you for putting me up to this.
I'm so sorry,
no, no.
Kate, but I think you could do it better than we could.
So we had the amazing opportunity to ask these two questions in our group. So we spoke actually very little about our own perceptions because we wanted to extract more information. But basically, we talked a little bit about I think some of us found it really interesting. I did that the collectivized cinemas were showing Hollywood films alongside these collectively produced newsreels and documentaries. And so we wanted to know what films they were showing. And we learned that Charlie Chaplin was, no surprise, a hit with the Cinema Union. We also talked a little bit about the relationship between the Popular Front filmmaking initiatives in the U.S. and in Spain, and it sounds like Spain was more influenced in terms of the collective model by Soviet filmmaking than Popular Front. But I think it's amazing to look at the mission statements of John Reed clubs and even some of the editorial, like the New Masses and the Film and Workers Film and Photo League, so closely parallel this. So we talked a little bit about that, and then Kay asked about Paul Robeson's time in Spain, which is really interesting, and apparently there is footage of him in Spain. And then somebody else was talking about how much of sort of a red herring Buñuel's work always seems to be, and that it's sort of hard to pin down in a really amazing way, and that it was really interesting to hear about the sort of the role of surrealism and avant-garde's obsession with fact, as well as the slippages between reality and so that's and
That was
there's
great, Kate. That was great.
but that was what I remembered.
That was great.
Okay, take me out.
Thank you, Kate. I will group four. I spoke with them, and no one really felt super comfortable speaking to the group. So I thought I'd summarize some of the things they would say. And Linda Ehrlich was in that group and was posed a few questions in the Q&A chat. So I'm going to ask them to the panelists right now. So I'll begin with one she's summarizing what the group said. Group four pointed out that the British newsreel and the Santos film use some of the same images of the church, other things, but with different narration, different POVs. There were concerns with not understanding Spanish and the voiceover narration. How important is that narration, and can films be read through images alone? That's like the first part of the question. Yes, and sort of beyond that is the difficulty of getting images from war zones then and today. How does that color the creation of films of these types? So that's what I know it's a little mouthful, but I'm gonna put it to all of you.
Yeah, I think severing off the narration or the voiceover in the Santos's reportaje makes it a different film. It really needs it's almost like reading. It's not so different from looking at an illustrated magazine or a photo magazine, and those written style is a lot like the newspapers. The main one at the time was called Solidaridad Obrera, and it's kind of like reading a written column with a succession of images alongside it. So it's interesting that those images nevertheless have so much potential to then be repurposed and used in so many other documentaries and in other moments, including not just by a British distributor, which was perhaps a little right leaning, but also by Nazi cinema, Italian fascist cinema, for specific uses. And then in the 70s in Spain, and during the transition, these same shots are used again with a particular political motive to set up the war as a kind of fratricidal fight between brothers. So So yeah, and what was the second part of the question?
It's sort of like saying there's difficulty getting
Oh yeah.
images in or war zones today, like newsreels. Like how does that color with the difficulty of getting these images and their repeat usage in reporting today? Like, you turn on CNN, MSNBC, and they'll play the same things over and over again with different ideological slants, I suppose.
Yeah, so that's, I think, is continuous and shared at different moments of history. So it's even Santos's film is there's a lot of reconstruction happening in that film. He wasn't actually necessarily able to shoot live the revolution. It's much more the aftermath of the first few days of the revolution. And yeah, that's an interesting conversation then to do with access and distribution even today in terms of what images you actually get out. And it's kind of helpful sometimes to have a bit of skepticism that the images that you're seeing are so as live as they claim to be, right? Even in the current context, in current conflicts and revolutions. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I'm just gonna go now, moving along. I'm gonna go to Juan Salas. You can report for group 5 if you feel comfortable doing so.
All of our friends are on this webinar.
Hey, how are
You
you?
should just, Juan, can you just answer your own questions?
No, what I'll say is that in our group, what we first thought is that there was some kind of language barrier. So some people wanted to know more about what was going on because it was French or Castilian, right? So some people didn't have access to the actual text. And that in itself was very interesting because it's exactly what you're talking about. Can we really read what we see without words, right? And that's precisely what you've been talking about how these images have been used by all sides, right? And for different purpose for the past 80 years.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I was just going to say too, because Amaya brought up, Santos's opinions about sound film. And sound film, it's not like it's new during the Spanish Civil War, but it's not that old either, right? We're talking, what, Juan, like 3-4 years of sound film by the time the war breaks out. So I also often wonder, just like us, some of us understand and don't understand. It just because you understand the language doesn't mean that the narration was always audible, necessarily in a cinema, or that the intertitles would be read. So I think even when we have language, I think we also have to remember that, cinema going may also be an uneven experience depending upon who's in the cinema, and that getting used to kind of technological views of reality and different forms of editing. The Buñuel, the España 36 is a much different editing style than the Santos, right? So even being able to kind of cognitively put those scenes together and hear the narration and assimilate what's happening may have also been disorienting for cinema goers at the time, depending upon kind of what was the relation between editing style and narration and image. So I would say it's not just our experience today, but it might have also mirrored some difficulty, at the time, where then to an earlier point, whether it's the shock of the images that is transcending any kind of cognitive difficulties, right? That you're still seeing shocking images of war that would have been registered as such.
Yeah, and the other thing that was connected to this is the fact that they were using in Buñuel's compilation there some of us can tell whose side is being portrayed, right? But it's something that otherwise might be impossible at the time, and it's something that is not specified in the text. So when you're talking about the audiences knowing what they're getting into, it's probably the only way that we can imagine how to read these receptions, right?
That's right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, even when they label the figures like La Pasionaria or Kiepo, you do have to kind of know whose side of the war they were on,
right?
Even when they're named, right? When they're featured in it and they're named, you may not know, right? Even if they're identified.
We had an interesting moment when we were talking because we were talking about George Orwell before the events of May 37. And some people in our group were actually already judging the anarchist rhetoric before the communists took over in Barcelona, right? And it's something that is interesting to think of, because this footage is prior, I think, to May 37, and we know, some of us know what's going to happen, but it's not there yet, right? So it's haunting as well. And one thing I mentioned was that, for example, how we were talking about religion and how impactful were those images of the burned churches. And I mentioned that the language in Ramos is very religious. I mean, is the religious one, is the one with the values that says you are hypocrites, because the good values, the humanist values of Catholicism that we've all been brought up with, right, in Spain in the 30s, have been violated by the institution that is meant to protect these people. So I thought it was interesting to mix the religious feeling on the anarchist side that I mentioned was as well common to the communists. These humanist values were something that were pervasive.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's not anti-clerical in a simple sense. Santos is keen to point out early on in the film, he blames the priests and soldiers for bringing the rifle into the altar. So he laid the blame on them for making those spaces military spaces. I mean, you can evaluate that claim however you like, but there's already that upset that these spaces, because of the launch of the coup, has been turned into spaces which are not sort of spaces for all, basically. And Orwell is a keen kind of witness of this and talks a little bit about the humanism, and also he kind of talks about anarchism in Spain as having a religious kind of quality. I'm 99% sure he's seen footage of Santos's film, but I can't say he definitely has. But it's interesting to compare the two accounts, right, of this film in the summer of 1936 and then Orwell arriving in December of 1936, and what extent prose writing is a memory of eyewitness experience, and to what extent it's actually his sort of dealing with mediated images, films from when he comes back, when he leaves Spain, or when he's in Spain and leaves Spain is like slightly unknowable, but an interesting thing to think about, and thing I'm actually working on in my book project as well. Yeah. One
thing we brought up too as well was who actually watched this compilation, right? Because Stephen in our group was quoting Roman Gubern and Hammond book, who is full of details, but we didn't know really if who saw these images and when, because it took a lot of time to put these things together. So 1936 is already talking about 1937, right?
That's right.
It's something that it's very slow, as opposed to our time when we have everything after a few seconds or in our life. Many months went by before you could actually have access to these images, and the war was lost in many cases before some of these images were actually widely distributed.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. Okay, so group 6. Group 6, I have second Phil. Phil, who's
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can indeed.
Okay, so one of the going last has both advantages and disadvantages. A number of the points I'll make relate to comments that have previously been shared, and some maybe don't. For those who were not fluent in either French or Spanish, the words of the captions being portrayed in the middle of the screen really interfered with the attention to the visual imagery. That's a shame. And of course, in modern situations, the captions would be on the bottom. And any rate, that was confusing to people who... let me go on to a point about, you had mentioned, Jordana is your name? You
Yeah.
had mentioned in the your first session about facts.
Mhm.
And yet in this session, just before, you talked about intentionality. I
Sure.
brought up the analysis of photography by Susan Sontag. It's been a long time since I read Sontag, but we talked a little bit about that.
Sure.
And the fact of how these images are not objective, they are subjective.
Yeah.
And the context, the choice by the filmmaker, including the choices to what to leave out,
Mhm.
and how it's put together, in what order. She was dealing with still photography, but
Yes. Mhm.
to my mind, it's exaggerated
Mhm.
with movies. And I'll just give one example that we talked about in terms of the context. The scenes in the church and with the mummies, which Sebastian told us beforehand to be careful to look at. There's no context about the religious oppression that the Spanish people had endured for so long, and the comparative luxury of the church and so forth. All you see are churches being emptied of artworks and being burned, which for most viewers would seem reprehensible. There's no explanation. And the mummies, to me at least, indicated how the church was so solicitous of its own, whereas the serfs and peasants, and certainly under Franco, people were just thrown in mass graves. Their bodies were not at all respected or preserved. But there's no context given for this imagery. So either the audience, which is a Sontag issue, the audience has to be known by the maker, and certain things don't need to be said, or the film is faulty because it doesn't provide the context for audiences which are naive to the subject matter.
Yeah.
Finally, and this is an extension of this, one of the people emphasized how some of the same images were used subsequently by Franco, or Francoists, and also by the non-intervention. Like, for example, I'm sure the church imagery was, and so on. So this whole notion of the existence or reality of films or photos was something I brought up. I apologize to the rest of the people in my group because I brought up the Sontag thing, and
No, I love that you brought up the Sontag thing. I was going to say, are you referring to on photography or regarding the pain of others? Because they're both kind of
well,
relevant.
on photography, I went back and looked it up. It's been so long.
No, I mean, and you're right on.
basically.
Yeah, you're right on about it. And first of all, too, I would think, when we think about, films and we're drawing on folks who write about still images, they're not unrelated, right? But they are kind of viewed and put together and, in different ways. And I would say, when Dali and Buñuel and others are writing about, Dali has this amazing essay called La Dada Fotografica, the photographic facts, and what they're taken with is that in this period is like the invention of the Leica camera. It's when they're discovering microscopic photography, and this, underwater photographer Jean-Paul Lavey, who is like bringing back footage of starfish. The photographic fact itself is revolutionary at this moment because it's showing people things that they hadn't seen before, right? In Russia, you have Rodchenko taking these, they call them like belly button photographs, right? Where he's taking like aerial views and worm eye views, and they're moving the camera around. And so this is shocking to people, right? At the time, that these are views and angles and close-ups that defy human perception, right? So that they'll take, a microscopic photograph of like a bacterium or something, and this is nothing that anyone's been seen before, right? So the photographic eye in that period is revolutionary because the photographic fact as being transmitted through these new technologies is shocking. So that's one piece that they're talking about, which and then cinema can be added to it. So in the same like 10-year period, you've got Dziga Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera, you've got Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin, you've got the surrealist experiments where also Joris Ivans and these documentarians, they're showing worlds that people hadn't seen before. So that sense of wonder and discovery does move between still photographs and films. But then to your other point about, okay, but scenes are being selected and editing is happening, that we know. And I think also folks in the movie theaters knew that because they were also watching fiction films, right? And musicals and, Pennies from Heaven, all these kind of things that are clearly manufactured. But it's also coming after a period of time of films like Metropolis or, Manhattan or, any of these films that are now classics in terms of silent and avant-garde cinema. But to your point about who's seeing them, right? Is the common cinema theater goer might have seen something more like King Vidor or Chaplin. But even those films kind of were playing with the idea that you were watching something. And so even, slapstick humor or silent films, we're giving people the cues to know, like, we're kind of in on the joke together. But there are also debates, as you know, because you've read Sontag and other people, about what the role of position was. Like, is our role as a viewer to be absorbed into the spectacle or to kind of be aware of it? And that you get into like theater, theory of theater like Brecht, where it's like you need to make the viewer aware that they're watching something. So our filmmakers who are documentarians are aware of all of this kind of soupy discourse that's going on and be like, oh, do we want to bring the viewer in so that they forget that they're watching a film? Or do they want to push them out and say, look, this is manufactured? Buñuel is coming more at this school that's saying this is manufactured. I'm putting my hand in here and I'm moving things around. Whereas some other filmmakers are wanting to kind of bring empathy in and bring you into the film. And it may also not be either or. They may be playing with both kind of strategies within the same film. So I think the Sontag reference is great. And I think, we're not watching them in 1936, 37. So we can sometimes lean on film critics or film culture, like reviews, which Amay and I have looked at, and Sebastian as well, and Juan and a bunch of other people. So you kind of rely on film reviews to kind of tell you, like, how were they viewing it? Like, did they view it as fact or did they view it as inflammatory or something else? Right?
Just to come
Well,
back.
I'm old enough to remember when the movies had newsreels before them.
Yeah.
I remember seeing them, and they were presented as fact.
That's right.
Not like the Buñuel film.
That's right. That's right.
You were seeing what was going on in the Pacific Islands
That's right.
During the war and so on.
That's right. And even
so I have no idea how an audience of the 1930s might have related to what they were seeing. But it's sort of a dialectic that Sontag sets up between objectivity and subjectivity.
Definitely.
And I think we need to look at films like this with that kind of realization in mind, that there's an interaction.
And remember, too, that you and your neighbor in the film house together are going to watch those films totally differently, right?
Exactly.
So, no, but you raised some really important points. And and thanks for bringing Sontag into the conversation. Always happy to have that reference on the table.
Just about the screening context for yourself and Juan, Reportaje was screened about 1 month afterwards in local cinemas in Barcelona. It wasn't screened as such as just that bit of film that much more after that, but repurposed a lot more beyond that. I have an open access article on the Space Between in English about it, and then there's a lot of scholarship in Spanish about it. But it is considerably different in its kind of distribution and who's watching it than, say, The Spanish Earth or many kind of fiction films. And yeah, it does rely on local context. Even the scene with the mummies, he's pointing out that the mummies have been handcuffed. So again, he's trying to show, look how badly the church is treating their own. And he says it on the commentary, but it's always within that kind of with critique within the local context that film is operating in, which is exactly why you can say it was eventually a propaganda failure, as much as it may have been a success within 1936 in Barcelona. In the long run, it was one of those things that spiraled. It didn't transcend its local context. Yeah. Cool.
I'm looking at the clock, and I don't know how much liberty we have to go on, or Dennis, if you're
I think I'm looking at so that's everybody, all the groups report. I was looking at the questions. We're at 8:35 right now. Maybe I do two and then we wrap up if that's all right with everybody. Well, again, thank you everybody for, hanging with us for this new format we're doing. So I'm going to ask first, I'm going to do some quick ones. This is from Kate Levy. Was there any cross-pollination between the ideas of Mateo Santos and the Popular Front in the US, especially the Workers' Film and Photo League and the John Reed clubs? That's a question.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit with Kate, but there's a
Okay.
film called Fury Over Spain, directed by the anarchist American journalist Louis Frank, as well as Juan Pareja, which uses film images from Santos's film. But that's in 37, so it's not that it's been inspired by Great Depression film necessarily. It's more how it's then received. But also they share context, right? So the John Reed clubs and Santos they're both sharing from Soviet context. So even if they don't talk directly, that might be why some of these mission statements are similar. Yeah.
I'm just gonna go. This is from Anita Reskia. I think just asking, could you please confirm the name of the children's newspaper from Catalonia you mentioned when speaking about the politicization of children? Was it Mirabal? Thank you.
Let's see. Can everyone read the chat?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. This is the question.
Oh no, host and panelists. Hold on, I have to get into a different.
Should be everyone.
So it's called Mirbal. Oops. Sorry, I don't know how to. Oh, here. Okay. So it's called Mirbal. Oops, got my autocorrect. Not mortal. Thank you. Mirbal. It's Mirbal. And I can just pull you. Oops. I may not be able to find it for you, but we actually have two copies of it in the Temament Library in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade archive. And I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing an easy reference to it. But just so you know, it was an imprint of the Catalan government, and there were only about 2 or 3 issues put out. So it's Mirbal is the magazine.
All right, thanks.
Not as a self-plug, but I used to have a website called Revistas y Guerra, but it was Flash, and so it's obsolete. But if you can find in a library the catalog of that exhibition, it's called Magazines in War or Revistas y Guerra. There's a little section on Mirbal and this discussion between the communists and the anarchists that I was referencing.
Okay, great. Yeah. We are really coming up on time. Sebastian, I don't know if there's any questions you think are more pertinent that I've missed maybe then, but I think we could probably, I know we've kept our beautiful panelists for too long already, I feel. Which
I
thank
feel
you
the
for
way.
making it available.
I think we could continue for another hour easy.
I've got a kid to put to bed. So.
Good. Well, I have 5 quick things to cover in my closing. The first one is to thank Jordana and Maya for doing this for us, and to thank everybody else for joining in this amazing conversation. I learned a lot, and it was really fun. The other thing I want to tell you is that, as you know, we are a nonprofit, and we can only do these kinds of free programming because you continue to support us. So if you feel inclined to continue to support us or to support us for the first time, we welcome that. All your donations are tax deductible and will be mentioned, if you would like, in the Volunteer, our quarterly magazine. The other 3 things are 3 great events that we have coming up that I want to call your attention to. On October 16, online at 3 p.m. Eastern, we have an event featuring Joyce Horman. Joyce Horman is a lifelong activist, very well known in the United States, whose partner, Charles Horman, was killed in Santiago de Chile in 1973, right after Pinochet's coup. The Oscar-winning Costa Gavras movie, Missing, where it was based on Joyce's story and Charlie Horman's story. And she'll be having a conversation with us on October 16th about her experiences in Chile, trying to look for what happened to her husband, as well as her life as an activist. So that's our Sussman lecture, named after Bill Sussman, and sponsored by the Sussman family on October 16th at 3. Then on November 20th, we have November 20th, the anniversary of Franco's death. We have an event featuring our own Nancy Wallach, who's going to report on the Jarama March, the event in Spain where people walk from battle scene to battle scene in the first battle that had Americans from the Lincoln Brigade participating in it, which was this year was honoring specifically the American volunteers participating in that. So Nancy will be presenting that on November 20th at 6 p.m.
Yeah, correct.
Online as well, right, Dennis?
Yes, online as well.
And then the day following, we have an in-person event. Sorry, I should mention that I forgot to mention that Joyce's the Sussman Lecture is co-sponsored by the Center for Constitutional Rights, which we're really proud to have them co-sponsor. They're such an amazing organization. And back when Michael Radner was president, we had a lot of contact with them, and it's great to rekindle that. So November 20th, the Jarama March at 6 p.m. And then November 21st, the day after, an in-person event at the King Juan Carlos Center, which Georgiana here directs.
Which is now Espacio de Culturas.
Espacio de Culturas, sorry. We have an amazing event connected to today's discussion. It's a half-hour short by a Spanish filmmaker from the Canary Islands, Miguel Morales, about Cuban volunteers in the Spanish Civil War. And the short is fully made up of archival footage. And so in a way, it's kind of like an España 1936, but then made now by a Canary Island filmmaker. And it will have English subtitles for those of you that are concerned about that. So that'll be.
And Amaya will be participating, and our lovely Jim Fernandez will also be participating in the post-screening conversation. And if we can corral Sebastian to come make a New York City visit, maybe he'll make an appearance too.
I'll try to work on that. So that's on Friday, November 21st at 6:30 at the Espacio de Culturas, the NYU building on Washington Square, formerly known as the King Juan Carlos Center. That was all I had to report. So thank you again for participating. Thank you, Georgiana and Maya. Thanks, Dennis and Mark, for your work behind the scenes and in front of the scenes. And we hope to all see you soon. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.